I was asked to talk for this session and was very much looking forward to talking in this session about behavioural science and technology. And the point I was going to make is very simple. I don't really accept the distinction. Or to put it another way, the only way I can accept a discussion of behavioural science and technology might be if you spelt the and apostrophe N apostrophe, a bit like fish and chips, that behavioural science and technology is probably a better way of thinking about it. Now let me explain. There's a really, really important distinction between invention and innovation. And the definition of innovation and how it's distinct from invention is that innovation is widely adopted and actually changes the way people behave. And in fact, Stuart Butterfield, who's the creator of Flickr and Slack and a few other technological startups, argues that the only useful definition of innovation is the extent to which it changes human behavior. If you produce something new, if you create something interesting, fascinating, even kind of mold-breaking, but people don't adopt it and it doesn't fundamentally change how people behave, you don't have an innovation, you've got an invention. Or possibly a completely meaningless and pointless discovery. And so what I'm saying here is that actually they're two sides of the same coin, and you could even go further and say that behavioural science is as much part of innovation as technology is. Now, let me put it another way. A few, mostly Austrian economists, Peter Drucker, whose dad was best friends with Josef Schumpeter, for example, essentially say that the only way a company can create value is through marketing or innovation. Everything else is a cost. Now, if you take that Austrian school view that the value of something is a product not only of what it is, but also of how it's perceived, then suddenly marketing and innovation become, at the very most, two sides of the same coin. So you can create value for human beings in two ways, in two directions perhaps, one of which is to find out what people want and work out a really clever way to make it, or the alternative is to work out what you can make and find out a really clever way to make people want it. Now, I would say that some of the greatest innovations, certainly some of the most lucrative innovations, are as much a product of behavioural science as they are of technology. So in the case of Uber, for example, the really decisive thing about that is a psychological insight at the heart of the product, which understands that people hate uncertainty more than they hate duration. Hence, nothing about Uber changed the experience of booking a cab by an order of magnitude, except perhaps the psychological elements of Uber, such as the map. Suddenly, waiting for a cab was literally 10 times less frustrating when you could watch the cab approach on a map. You knew that the guy who'd promised you the cab wasn't lying completely because there was a cab on its way to you, and you could tell a story about why the cab wasn't there yet. Ooh, look, he's stuck at those traffic lights. I'll make myself another cup of tea. Okay, other aspects of Uber, probably the ego might have been a 10x kind of moonshot transformation in that walking out of a building at the moment your car draws up is 10 times better for the ego than standing around on a rain-swept street corner wondering when your car's going to arrive. Or the ease of payment, where you simply say, thanks mate, and get out of the car, rather than having to fart around with cash, coins, change, receipts, and all that kind of nonsense. So the only aspects of Uber which really match up to a 10x innovation, a really significant disruption, are psychological, admittedly empowered by technology, but they're still principally psychological insights where the value is then delivered by a technology. In the case of Nespresso, for example, yes, it's a very, very important invention, but the really decisive thing is that previously no rational person would have thought that there was a market for people paying 60 pence for a cup of coffee, which they made themselves and consumed at home. The psychological magic of that was that by selling the coffee in a pod, not in a jar, everything changed. If you'd sold it in a jar, let's say for an equivalent amount of caffeine, a jar of Nespresso coffee might cost £30. You'd look at that, compare it with Nescafe or Illy or Lavazza, and you go, that's batshit insane. There's no way I'm paying that. On the other hand, when you put it in a pod, suddenly the consumer's frame of reference is no longer Nescafe, it's Starbucks. And they go, well, 60p, that would have cost me £2.40 at Starbucks. I'm quids in here. And so in order to genuinely innovate, typically your innovation will lie somewhere on a spectrum between, very largely technological and very largely psychological. And the two, of course, are complementary. A brilliant thing that no one notices or no one can adopt, which is, interestingly, pretty much video conferencing, as we experienced it up until the coronavirus pandemic, is pretty much useless. What was the remaining challenge with video conferencing, at least for the last 2 or 3 years, after the technology got pretty good, was no longer a remaining technological hurdle to clear. It was a psychological one, all to do with collective behavior, framing, how we perceive working remotely. And I've been a kind of long-time evangelist for remote working and flexible working for all kinds of reasons, partly selfish, partly because I believe it's an opportunity for a significant productivity increase in all kinds of areas, from education to administrative, managerial, white-collar working behavior. I think within this technology lies the potential for something which can speed things up, speed up collaboration. I think technologies such as email, which are asynchronous, are largely a massive frictional drag on business decision-making and consensus. I'll give you a little clue to this. Okay, how many times have you got an email where someone says, can you make a film for the behavioural science course? Or can you do so-and-so, so-and-so? Or can you answer this complex question about behavioural science? You go, shit, this is actually quite difficult. Oh God, this is going to be a pain. I'm not going to be able to watch TV. So you go, let me find a completely gratuitous question to ask in response to this first request. So you go, what can I ask? I know. When will you need it by? And you click send and you go, oh, thank shit for that. I bought myself 48 hours. Okay, we've all done it. We all do it all the time. When you have asynchronous communication, essentially it's a massive exercise in buck passing, arse covering, responsibility ducking and everything of the kind. In many occasions, and anybody who's actually been through the experience of conveyancing a home will know this perfectly. You have that feeling when you go through the business of buying a house, that you pass something on to your solicitor, who passes it on to the vendor's solicitor, who then queries it and 3 days later sends it back. And you have that immense feeling, oh God, if only we could get these people all in the same room together, we could sort this bastard out in an afternoon. And so for genuinely, pro-business, pro-productivity reasons, as well as selfish reasons, I've always been a fan of remote and flexible working. I also think, as an interesting point, which is work I've done with Matthew Lesh in the Adam Smith Institute, that flexible working makes possible a far more nuanced value exchange between employer and employee. So instead of that very crude economic distinction between work and leisure, i.e. between 9 and 5 you work, the rest of the time is supposedly leisure, you say, well, hold on, there are various things that an employee might value alongside leisure. We quite enjoy quite a lot of our work. The worst part of our work is not the productive part of our work. It's not the economically valuable part of the work. It's things like commuting or presenteeism or extraneous behaviours, which are, or signalling behaviours, which are actually kind of layered on top of work as as a kind of weird heap of bullshit. And if we could get rid of that, we could be more productive and enjoy our work more. How many people retire not because they actually want to give up work, but because they want to give up commuting? It's a fairly significant question. And so by making the value exchange more nuanced, you can say people value free time, but they also value free when, and they value free where. In other words, the freedom to work where it suits you might be a significant benefit. but also the freedom to work at a time of day when it suits you, regardless of the hours you put in, may be of huge value to people who are parents, carers, or who have other commitments to members of their family or household. And so I've always been a huge fan of this. What I discovered was that one of the major hurdles and obstacles that had to be overcome was very much a framing question. When I told my team of 15 people, hey, you're free to work from home, nobody did. Okay? I couldn't understand it. I said, I've given you the freedom. I do it myself. I've even set a bit of an example. Nobody does. And that's because instinctively they saw it as a concession. That every time you took advantage of this, you were kind of burning reputational air miles in the process. So they reserved working from home for very extreme conditions. And it was only when I said, no, you're misunderstanding me, guys. I actively want you to work from home, that people adopted the behaviour at the kind of volume I wanted. And it was only when we all agreed to work from home, by and large, on the same days, that the real productivity improvements and the commuting avoidance kicked in. So that's a classic case where what might have taken 5 or 10 years for us to discover became accelerated by a pandemic. But equally, the basic technological infrastructure to make video conferencing good was already sitting there in plain sight. And it shows in some senses an extraordinary failure of the corporate imagination that we failed to take advantage of it. So here's the thing to remember, okay? You should really have your marketing and your behavioral science and behavioral psychology department and your R&D department should really be the same thing. Unless you actually have an idea about how you innovate something, and alongside it an idea about how that innovation may become adopted and sold and popular and universalized, you're not playing with a full deck. Okay? And arguably the same in reverse. Unless, as behavioural scientists, we're fairly well attuned to what is technologically possible, we won't have the best ideas we can in terms of making things accessible that weren't before. So in brand terms, in marketing terms, the way I describe a huge behavioural shift, such as that we experienced with video calling, is that Zoom, or working remotely, or attending meetings remotely, or streaming conferences rather than holding conferences in a physical place and charging 200 quid, okay? So the remote attendance of things has gone from being Dr. Pepper to being Coke. It's exactly the same finding, if we look for patterns here, as that discovery by Cambridge University that if you have more vegetarian options on a menu, far more people, including hardcore carnivores, end up eating meat-free meals. The choice has now been completely rebalanced. Previously, if you attended a meeting, you were a normal guy. Diet Coke, please. If you were the person who wanted to attend the meeting remotely, you were the weird guy who'd ask for Dr. Pepper. One of the magical qualities of Coke is that you can ask for Coca-Cola everywhere, from a beach shack in Jamaica to a Michelin-starred restaurant, and there's nothing remotely weird about the request. That isn't true about Dr. Pepper. First of all, it's a strange request to begin with, and one where the response of no is likely to come with a level of implicit ridicule in terms of your request. And suddenly, we've completely reshaped this. And so the really vital thing to understand is that there is no use for technology without some applied psychology alongside it. I'll tell you a lovely little framing anchoring story. So I like to use the same techniques I might use in advertising on family members, not always successfully. I've got children. They defy every conceivable bloody logic, to be honest. But anyway, with my dad was 80 years old. He wouldn't get Sky. Bear in mind he was born in 1930, so for most of his life he'd never paid for television. And suddenly, £17 a month seems a huge amount to spend on television. I offered to pay for it for him. No, it's still too expensive, he said. No, it's ridiculous. £17 a month is crazy. And I did the most simple Don Draper mind trick imaginable. I simply said, it isn't £17 a month though, is it, Dad? It's 60p a day. And he, not being an appalling mathematician, said, what the hell difference does that make? And I said, well, you already spend £2 a day on newspapers. Now, bear in mind, my dad's not interested in sport, okay? He's not really interested in movies or fiction, but anything that's a documentary, particularly historical, will fascinate him for hours. He's also a strange fan of bangers and cash, but we'll park that one for now, okay? And when I said, look, you already spend £2 a day on newspapers, so spending another 60 pence to enjoy 200 extra channels of factual and news television is hardly ridiculous. Suddenly it was a complete epiphany. He got Sky, weirdly he paid for it himself, and is now a kind of Sky evangelist with all the oldies of the Wye Valley, going around the pensioner community going, I can't believe you haven't got Sky Plus. He ridicules my brother, who's an astrophysicist, for not having Sky television. Okay, that's my point about how in everything, the value of something is always a product of context, meaning, comparison. There's no context-free idea of the util or of utility without some sort of marketing element being deployed. And the magic of marketing is by describing something new in a different way, you can make something which naturally strikes us as being absurd or difficult or ridiculous, you can suddenly make it seem normal. And the great problem now with lots of technologies, I've mentioned Sky, I've mentioned video conferencing. What about things like electric cars? What about things like solar panels on your roof? I would argue exactly the same thing applies. The technology we need is no longer electronic in nature, it's psychological. Now, one problem we'll always face here, and it ain't going to go away, is that when something succeeds, everybody bigs up the technological aspect of its success or the economic aspect, and they downplay the psychological aspect. There were people working at Apple who used to say of Steve Jobs, I don't get what Steve even does, like he can't even code. Okay, so people in a technological mindset tend to be disparaging of, and of course gain no status from, the assertion that part of the reason for their success is its innate psychological appeal rather than its objective technological superiority. And I call this, and I'll end with this, the fish restaurant problem, okay? Now, if I asked a bunch of you, particularly if you're wearing suits, particularly if you're in a business meeting, why are there more fish restaurants next to the sea? Immediately people would start going, access to fresh fish, low distribution costs, easy logistics, access to local fishermen. Now, okay, that seems perfectly plausible, it's logical, and therefore once something makes sense, in business world or academic world, we tend to go, that makes sense, ergo it's true, it's the real explanation. And we've got to be really, really alert to doing this. Because I would argue, if that were really the right explanation, you'd find lots and lots of fish restaurants 5 miles inland. But the truth is we don't. They're all clustered by the coast. I also suspect that the cheapest way to buy fresh fish reliably in large quantities is probably at Billingsgate Market rather than relying on some local fisherman to get lucky that day. I don't think that's the real explanation at all. I think the real explanation, just as rosé wine tastes better by the sea, I think the real explanation lies in psychophysics. First of all, fish probably taste better when you're by the sea. Would kind of make sense in a funny kind of way, wouldn't it? But secondly, because it does, we've then established traditions and habits that have become deeply embedded that when we go down to the seaside, we're much more likely to eat fish and chips or some sort of seafood thing. Now, the reason I make this point is that we are always driven to instrumentalist explanations for the success of something rather than psychological explanations. And I think in the same way, when people write Harvard Business Review case studies of things, they love to emphasize the economically rational component that worked rather than the psychologically ingenious one that worked. So I'll end on this. If you look at polythene bags and the fact that paying 5 pence for a shopping bag seemed to have an enormous downward effect on people's need for carrier bags, okay, the standard economic explanation is that it's the 5p that did all the work. I'd argue that the 5p did some of the work, But a lot of the work was simply done by changing the framing of the question and the choice architecture and default around having a bag. Previously, if the store didn't offer you a bag, it was kind of rude. Therefore, they handed over your Boots prescription or whatever in a plastic bag. And if you said, no, I don't want a bag, that was a deeply weird Dr. Pepperish kind of behavior. There are people behind you in the queue thinking, geez, this man's a crank. Okay. On the other hand, by charging 5p, you have to ask. And that fundamentally changes the default. Now, I have no doubt that when this success is presented to other people, the economic explanation will be considered not only partial, but entire and sufficient. We've got to be really careful about this. Nearly every great invention and innovation is as much a product of genius marketing, Henry Ford, as it is of genius engineering. And we're not apportioning the credit in the right way, and therefore we're not looking for success and innovation necessarily in the right place. We assume it always lies in a technological field, and then the psychology takes care of itself. This is so wrong, it's painful. Thank you very much indeed.